west down Sunset right now, and I'm reminded of the story I heard about the first time the band heard Mr. Tambourine Man on the radio. So it happened right here on Sunset Boulevard. The entire band was in a 56 Ford station wagon when the song came on, and they had to pull over so they wouldn't wreck. It was absolute bedlam. It was right out of That Thing You Do. I mean, you can only imagine what it must have been like. That kind of thing only happens to you the first time, and usually only once in your life. But it's on. So here we are about 3 miles west of the Sunset Strip in Beverly, Glen, and this is a canyon that connects Bel Air with Van Nuys, and it's also the street that David Crosby spent his later days in the Byrds, anyways. So as you can see, we're walking up from the Beverly Glen store, canyon store. Every canyon in LA seems to have one of these, booze and cigarettes. Next to Gene Clark, I think that David Crosby was the most complex member of the Byrds. He was single-minded and strong-willed, and he reveled in the spotlight. And I also think he saw himself as the leader of the group, even though his bandmates probably didn't. He was neither the main songwriter nor the lead singer. But you know, in my opinion, what he really brought to the table was his harmony voice and his incredible sixth sense about where to put that voice. I think it was every bit as important as McGuinn's 12-string Rickenbacker. You know, David Crosby likes to tell a story about his last moments as a Byrd, which occurred right here. Hillman and McGuinn had driven up here in their Porsches, basically to drop in and say hello and fire him. Having had this happen to me before, not with the Porsches, but the firing, it's like breaking up with a girlfriend, maybe even worse. Unwittingly, they did him probably the biggest favor of his career. It's Shakespearean in the irony. Delicious. So now we've moved east one canyon over from where the David Crosby house is, and this is called Benedict Canyon. So this property used to be owned by Zsa Zsa Gabor, and in 1965 it was rented for a week by the Fab Four, by the Beatles. And one afternoon they decided to throw an epic party right here. It's also purported that this is where David Crosby and Roger McGuinn turned George Harrison on to Ravi Shankar's music. One thing is for sure, what they did turn him on to definitely is they turned the Beatles on to LSD here. George and John had done it once before, but it was Ringo's first time. He mentions swimming in the swimming pool here, loaded on LSD. It was like swimming in Jell-O. You just gotta love Ringo, man. Another notable acid dropper who was a guest of the Byrds here was Peter Fonda. And through the course of the night, he kept on turning to George and mentioning a old gunshot wound that he had and saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." And he was doing this ad nauseum. It was really kind of starting to bother George Harrison. Eventually, John Lennon had had enough, and he turned to Fonda and he said, "So you know what it's like to be dead? You're making me feel like I've never been born." Excuse my bad Liverpudlian accent, but to be young and famous and high. So if you're going to explore the LA rock scene in the 60s or 70s, all roads inevitably lead here to Laurel Canyon. It's the mothership. Gene Clark was renting a house at the end of the cul-de-sac right here. As a matter of fact, his neighbor across the street was Barry McGuire. It was famous for the big parties they'd have here. Apparently, they didn't believe it was the eve of destruction. Gene was a prolific songwriter, great songwriter. I think his I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better rivals Turn, Turn, Turn is the Byrds' very best song. So the way it works is that every time the radio plays your song, if you're the writer, BMI or ASCAP collect a very small residual, but after millions of times that adds up, and after several months, Gene was driving a Porsche while the other guys were sharing a VW. That didn't sit well with the band. You know, Gene was a pretty laid-back guy. He took a lot of crap from some of the guys in the band. I think they were a bit jealous of his talent and definitely of his bank account. You know, it all came to a head when Gene, who was intensely afraid to fly, refused to get on an airplane for touring, and really the last thing he did was co-write 8 Miles High and record it. He left just days after that. You know, although his solo records were not very commercially successful, he did write a masterpiece. His 4th record was called No Other, and if you've never checked it out, I suggest you do. It's a really great record. Okay, next Laurel Canyon. We're now up on Coal Crest. We're in the Kirkwood Bowl section of Laurel Canyon, almost at the very tip top, and we're looking for Roger McGuinn's house. As you can see, the road is really winding and very narrow, and it's really hard to believe that you're less than 5 minutes from the Sunset Strip up here. Now, there's no question that Roger McGuinn was the most gifted musician and arranger in the band. He was also somewhat of the de facto lead singer, I think because he embraced the Bob Dylan songs early on when not everyone in the band did. I think he also deserves a lot of credit for Sweetheart of the Rodeo because, you know, Graham Parsons or no Graham Parsons, that album wasn't getting done without McGuinn's blessing, much to his credit. All right, so here it is. And, you know, another interesting fact about this house is that after Roger McGuinn of the Byrds lived here, David Cassidy of the Partridge Family lived here, and after he moved out, Don Henley of the Eagles lived here. Kind of a avian thing going on here, but this is the house that Henley and Glen Fry wrote Desperado in. There's also a great story about an owner after that who was painting the bathroom, and in between the commode and the wall they found a Quaalude bottle that belonged to David Cassidy. The 70s. So anyways, we're going to continue walking up the road another just a couple minutes to our next stop. You know, it's amazing when you're up here, you really start realizing how interconnected everything is and how small Laurel Canyon is. And that's really why I think the scene was so vital. Everyone could walk to everyone else's house. Anyways, here we go. So now we're on this itty bitty street at the very tip top of Laurel Canyon called Magnolia, and down here at the end is where Chris Hillman's guest house was. This is the site of the tiny house right here. All that remains is the foundation. There was a fire here. Chris Hillman was working on his motorcycle. Some gas spilled, the water heater ignited it caught fire, and it went up. He lost everything, including his eyebrows, in the fire. The other important thing about this location right here is this is where Roger McGuinn and Hillman wrote So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star. And it was from an article in a Teen Beat magazine they were looking through. That was the inspiration, but I also have to say the view had to have had something to do with it. But I think most importantly, the Byrds brought in a young, charming, recently transplanted Georgia boy to fill in the spot vacated by Crosby, and his name was Graham Parsons. Parsons was hell-bent on bringing country music to rock and roll, but he needed an ally like Chris Hillman and the Byrds to bring that into fruition. Their 1968 album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, was every bit as game-changing as Mr. Tambourine Man was. And you know, although the album was a commercial and critical flop at the time, the years have been very kind to it, and it's now thought of as one of the most influential albums ever made in rock and roll. And as Roger McGuinn said, we were pioneers with arrows in our back. You know, not long after the release of Sweetheart, Hillman and Graham Parsons went on to form the Flying Burrito Brothers, and that left Roger McGuinn as the lone Byrd. But he continued on with the Byrds well into the 70s with drummer Gene Parsons and legendary guitar player Clarence White. And throughout it all, I think the jingle and jangle has remained, and that is what is going to be the Byrds' legacy after all. And if you haven't done so yet, I would much appreciate it if you subscribed or, you know, liked the channel. So on behalf of myself and the Byrds, that's going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank you for hanging out with us, and keep playing it and keep playing it loud. Peace out.